Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Simon Wunderlich, and with me is Professor Dr. Stephen Gross. He's an associate professor at NYU and author of the book Energy and Power, Germany in the Age of Oil, Atoms, and Climate Change. Let me dive right in and first ask you, why do you care about German energy?
Well, I care about German energy for a number of reasons. For one, I'm very concerned about climate change, personally and on a social level. And two, Germany for a long time, since 2000, has seemed to offer a model path forward, although there are a lot of challenges and paradoxes in German energy policy. So it's a fascinating subject to study.
Okay, that's interesting. So specifically, climate change, we'll go over that as well. To first broadly understand the energy market, what are the main energy sources that are out there and how do they differ from each other?
Okay, well, we have oil, which is the most widely used type of energy. It's not used for generating electricity, but used more for automobiles and for transportation. Natural gas, which has been in the news. It comes from outside of Germany, from Russia, but also from Norway. It can be used both for heat and for electricity. It's cheap, easy to build, or it was cheap before the crisis, easy to build gas turbines, but it has certain problems, geopolitical as well as climate. Renewable energy burst onto the scene after 2000 in Germany. It is increasingly cheap, suffers from problems of intermittency, which is a big challenge. And nuclear power, which has been around since the 1970s. It's used for primarily generating electricity. There's a whole social constellation of problems around nuclear power. It's very reliable to a certain extent, but increasingly it's expensive in terms of building new nuclear capacity, if you want to expand nuclear. And there's coal, which in Germany today and much of Europe means lignite coal, which is dirty brown coal, also cheap, not as cheap as renewables, generates local pollution and is the worst the worst type of pollution for climate change. And I'm happy to unpack kind of more of those details if you like.
Yeah, of course. Maybe along the way as we go forward, you explained in your book you have a few phases for Germany laid out. So Germany's energy transitions. Maybe we would just start right there with the first phase. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So the book really looks at Germany from 1945 up until 2000, and the coda kind of goes to the present. And I argue that Germany has gone through 5 very tumultuous energy transitions. The first of these was the rise of oil in the 1950s and the 1960s. Germany had been a coal-based economy in the 19th century, even into the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s, where America was adopting oil in the 20s with Henry Ford in the Model T. Germany was later. Germany had a lot of domestic coal in the Ruhr. It was hard coal, not lignite, so deep surface mine, deep underground mine. About 500,000 people in the Ruhr were employed mining coal. And oil burst onto the scene through a series of American policies, but also German-specific policies under the CDU and Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard. And it competed for a while with oil in certain areas in terms of running trains, even generating power used for industrial heat, industrial processes. So oil and coal were competing in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and this generated a series of coal crises that were very socially disrupted in Germany. The first of these erupted in 1958, the second in 1966 and 1967, and this led German politicians to care deeply about energy in general. So part of the argument of my book is that Germans have a precocious interest in seeing energy as a political subject, a political topic, because of these coal crises. In America, I'm based in America, the prime energy crisis that seems to put energy on the map as a subject is the 1973 oil shock. But in Germany, it happens much earlier, even really already in 1950 with the Korean War, which is in some ways an energy crisis.
So coal crisis meaning the prices explode, or what?
It was an opposite. It was a crisis of overproduction, that there was too much energy in 1958. The oil fields of the Middle East were coming online, and the big oil companies like Exxon, Shell, BP were building a lot of infrastructure to move oil cheaply from the Middle East across the Mediterranean into the ports, mainly Rotterdam in the case of Northern Europe. And there was too much energy. So there was too much coal being produced, too much oil, and coal producers couldn't sell enough. And they had to close down mines and lay off people. So over the span of a decade, 1 to 200,000 people lost their jobs. This is a huge social question. What do we do with these people? How do we reemploy these people? And this led to the first formal parliamentary inquiry in 1959, 1960, and 61 into energy. It was called the coal inquiry, but it was really looking at all different energy types in Germany to see how they related and interacted with one another.
So in the age of coal, or in the first phase, or before the first phase, the coal was being mined in Germany. So the energy came came domestically. Now the oil comes from abroad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a factor. That's an important factor geopolitically to think about, right?
Correct. And even in the first coal crisis in 1958, you see representatives of the coal industry and also unions and union leaders, coal miner union leaders, raising the question of geopolitics and using the concept of energy security and saying that we pay a premium for security for other things. We should pay a premium for security in terms of energy, that coal is domestic, it's reliable, but oil is not. Oil comes from abroad. This was also in the context of another energy crisis in 1956, the first Suez Canal closure, when Nasser of Egypt sunk ships, closed the Suez Canal. His allies in the Middle East blew up some of the pipelines as well that channeled Middle Eastern oil to ports on the Mediterranean. Something like 2/3 of Europe's oil came through these networks, through the Suez or the neighboring pipelines, and all of a sudden they couldn't get oil. They had to rely on America to kind of reroute tankers either around Africa or to reroute tankers from Venezuela and the east coast of America. And so this raised the specter. All of a sudden, Germany's energy system was at risk of major interruptions in a way that it had never been before. So energy security as a concept, as a political concept, becomes important in Germany already in 56. And then in 58, with the coal crisis, you see coal representatives making the case to preserve their energy in the name of security and domestic security. Again, by contrast with America, you don't see similar things until the 1970s, where Nixon, in the early 1970s, in the context of rising oil prices, talks about energy independence, and later energy security becomes a concept as well. But in Germany, this is happening 2 decades earlier, and so this is part of a larger story of the early and intense politicization of energy in the Federal Republic.
So at first with the coal mines, were they state-owned, or were those companies who were completely free in acting, or how did that work?
They were private companies, but they worked through cartels. So Ruhr since the late 19th century, had this kind of deep interlocking connections of companies connected to the steel industry, connected to other coal companies, sometimes even connected to other energy companies. So it was not a free market, but it's not state-owned. It was run by kind of oligopolies and cartels. This is in contrast to other European countries that nationalized the coal industry and put it under state control, both in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. So Germany does have a market-based organization in coal, but it's very, controlled by oligopolies. Ludwig Erhard, the economics minister of Germany in the 1950s and 1960s, did not like this and wanted to use oil very consciously to break the power of coal cartels, because he thought that the coal cartels were keeping the price of energy too high. So he was instrumental in lowering oil tariffs, making the oil market as free as possible to bring as much oil in. And he saw oil to be more of a free market energy, even though in many ways it's not. And I can talk about that. And he thought that this would help lower energy prices and break the power of the coal cartels. And an interesting connection to this is the way, and here we get into some deeper history, and stop me if I'm getting too in the weeds, but the way that many Germans in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly ordo liberals and others on the right of the political spectrum, understood the rise of the Nazis, was that it was partly about German business and big business throwing their weight behind the Nazi leadership to support them into power in the 1930s. And so Erhard, and in fact, the American occupation authorities saw coal as being, and these coal cartels as having been allies of the Nazis. And this is another kind of political reason why they wanted to break the power of the coal cartels.
Interesting. That's very interesting. And then there was a transition to oil, but how? I mean, coal didn't get completely replaced, right? So how much was oil? How much was coal after the transition? Can you put a percentage
great
on
question. So the transition took what I would call the rise of oil, because it doesn't totally replace coal. You're correct in that. The rise of oil took about 2 decades, from the mid 1950s up until 1973, when oil by 1973 accounts for roughly half of all the primary energy. So that's energy in its initial use before it's being transformed into end energy use. Oil accounted for half of all of German energy by the 1970s. So that's a dramatic rise. It's if you look in the history of energy transitions, this is one of the quickest energy transitions anywhere ever, really. Coal use declines. Hard coal use declines in Germany. Hard coal mining declines. Germans do begin to import hard coal from other parts of the world that can mine it cheaper because they're less unionized or access is cheaper. And lignite coal continues to be burned primarily for electricity.
One question: Can I interrupt you? Okay, why wasn't that happening before, using coal from other countries?
It was a little bit in the 1950s from America, actually. So there were American shipments of coal, hard coal from West Virginia and other mines. The cost of transportation was high. In the 1950s, there's the whole container revolution in shipping, which doesn't really come into play until the 60s and the 70s and really the 80s. So that opens up the ability to move coal in bulk across long distances and to make it cheap. And German coal was still relatively competitive until the 1950s and the 1960s. Labor costs go up. The mines, you have to go deeper and deeper, and the general price of energy falls. So all of these kind of factors make German-specific coal uncompetitive, in the 1960s. But there are other sources of hard coal that do remain more competitive. But really, a key part of the story is the persistence of lignite coal. And here there's a particular utility company, RWE, which is in the Ruhr and the Rhineland, and they own a lot of the lignite coal in West Germany. So my story doesn't really talk about East Germany, but I'm happy to talk about that if you like. And so they have an integrated utility company where their subsidiary owns brown coal deposits, and it gives them a very cheap source of energy. And so this particular utility, RWE, does a particular kind of effort to use brown coal for a long time.
And then, now we kind of switched with the history, but then comes after oil the rise of nuclear, right? Or am I missing something? Okay, nuclear rises.
Yes, yeah. So that's what I would call the second energy transition. It's a partial energy transition in the sense that nuclear never captures a big share of the market, and it's very much a state-driven energy transition. Mariano Mazzucato has this concept of the entrepreneurial state, where states often act not only to create market conditions, but to take on risk, to promote investment, and to choose particular industries. And this is very much what's happening beginning in the late 1950s, but really in the 60s and the 70s, that both political parties, the CDU and the SPD, get behind nuclear power. And they put a lot of state effort into building up the nuclear industry. The state takes on a lot of risk, ensuring the possibility of a meltdown, for example. The state assumes a lot of the insurance risk for that would have made it prohibitively expensive for companies to build nuclear reactors. The state gives generous subsidies and is involved in other aspects of the nuclear industry. In fact, many of the utility companies that would have used nuclear to generate electricity in this, in the early 60s says, we don't need it. We have enough energy. We don't need an energy transition, but it's really kind of government experts and scientists and other business elites who think that nuclear technology is going to be the wave of the future, and the Germans need to get in on this technology and learn it, that they're the ones who are really pushing nuclear power.
Why did they think that?
They thought there was going to be big export potential for nuclear industry, and that there would be synergies, that it's such a high-tech, engineering-focused and knowledge-based sector that building up a skill set in that particular energy sphere would kind of create synergies and spillovers, and that this would create major lucrative export contracts, that there was a big hope that Germany would be exporting nuclear reactors to Latin America, to the Middle East, to East Asia. And in fact, in the 1970s, you see the biggest nuclear deal in the world with Brazil unfold between German industry and the Brazilian government. It doesn't end up being as big as people hope, but that's an example of how this is portrayed and kind of marketed, and people have this optimism that it will be a huge export sector. There's nuclear euphoria everywhere in the Western world in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So it takes a certain amount of political work to separate nuclear energy and electricity production from the fear of nuclear weapons, everywhere. But once that political work is done, and America is instrumental in kind of making that shift with Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, that people are optimistic that that energy will be too cheap to meter, and this ultimately doesn't play out for a number of reasons. But there's big optimism in the late 50s and the 60s, and states, France, Britain, America, the Soviet Union put a lot of state effort into building up nuclear power.
Too cheap to meter? What does that mean?
Oh, to meter is to count. So in America, or in English, you have the energy meter. So this is an expression that the head of the American Atomic Energy Association or agency has this statement that it's going to be too cheap to even bother measuring basically how much energy we need, because it's going to be so abundant from nuclear power.
I'm kind of going forward too fast, maybe, but you said the state or the government was partly funding the nuclear companies with regards to security, and what do they get in exchange for that? Just knowing that there will be nuclear power plants in Germany, or also some kind of power over the plants?
They don't get much oversight over the plant. I mean, there's of course regulatory and safety standards that local states, local courts, and also the national government oversee in Germany. But really, it's kind of a bet or a gamble that this will be an energy that's going to pay off and help the German economy in general, with cheap energy and with kind of the knowledge and expertise and skill set that you get, and the hope that it will be a big employment sector as well. That building nuclear plants will employ a lot of skilled people, and that this is an important consideration, particularly in the 1970s. So this is one reason, or one argument that state officials use to continue pushing nuclear power after the oil crisis, partly the argument of energy security, that we can build nuclear plants, they'll be domestic, they'll be safe. but also, you know, German economies everywhere begin to slow down. Unemployment rises in the 1970s, and so the jobs argument is used by officials, by state officials, and also this is also used by the nuclear industry and the utility companies too.
And is there the idea that nuclear becomes the main power source, and the others fall behind? So even less reliance on coal and less on oil?
Yes, there is great kind of nuclear utopic visions that nuclear advocates, and I have some fascinating graphs in my book. I don't know if I could show them here, but where you have these forecasts projecting forward, done. They German experts, international experts as well, begin doing these really in the 1960s, but in the 1970s, it's kind of the height of them. And they're dramatic forecasts that nuclear power is going to kind of destroy all other energies that you see. Energy use, these experts predict in Germany, will continue to increase year after year at a very, very high rate. And that other energies will wither, coal, oil, natural gas, and that nuclear will become the dominant source. So this is the hope and the expectation among a certain cadre of people. And these are nuclear engineers, government experts, some economists as well get into forecasting, and they are wildly optimistic. Part of what I talk about are how these expectations then shape energy policy in the 1970s, and how the environmental movement and then the Green Party begin to amass what's called counter expertise and their own sets of forecasters, their own economists who have a different set of assumptions and that lead to totally different predictions about the future energy shape that the German economy will take.
How did the other companies, the other energy companies, meaning from the Middle East and also the maybe not so big anymore coal companies, how did they act after hearing that announcement that nuclear will be the new source?
Well, in the 1960s, there was tension between domestic coal companies and some utilities who wanted to move into nuclear energy, and also the engineering sector that would build the nuclear plants. That there was certainly tension among them. This was, in a sense, resolved in the 1970s with another vision of kind of combining nuclear and coal to use process heat from the nuclear power sector, the waste heat. Nuclear energy generates, immense amounts of heat. You use that to generate electricity, but a lot of it is wasted. But you can use this process heat to transform coal into different things, and to even liquefy coal and to change it into a gas, and then use it for other uses. So there's this other technological vision that emerges in the 1970s when the price of oil rises, and it makes this process heat and this idea of using process heat from nuclear power, applying it to coal to make it into liquid gas or oil even. This is a technological vision that brings kind of coal and nuclear producers together. In terms of the oil companies, they're also they think that these predictions are wildly optimistic. Things like companies like Exxon, BP, and Shell, they think that nuclear power is not going to take off as much as the government experts. They're not as concerned because oil is not used really primarily for generating electricity, where nuclear power is, and so it's not like oil and nuclear are going to be direct competitors. So there's not political infighting between them. Really, it's between nuclear and coal, but coal's fortunes are declining, and so they kind of grasp onto this technological vision in the 1970s, but that never actually emerges.
Could you elaborate more on the Green Party and its impact on the nuclear power movement?
Yeah. So this is a big part of German history, right? And it's a big part of the story that the anti-nuclear movement had been kind of small, had existed on a local basis since really the late 1950s, but it was really only in the 1970s that it took off. Partly, it's a political story where the 1968 generation of kind of left-wing youth and people who were mobilized, that fizzled, and some of them transitioned to paying attention to environmental issues or local issues through what's called citizens initiatives. Partly, it's a story of technocracy and kind of top-down state decision-making going too far. I talked about the entrepreneurial state, where the state was really pushing nuclear power. After the 1973 oil crisis, they doubled down on nuclear power and had these big visions for building even more nuclear plants. But they had very little input from local citizens, that most of the decisions about where to put reactors, what to do with them, were made behind closed doors between federal state officials, business leaders, and local state officials of the lender. And citizens began to push back, and it was interesting that it was a very heterogeneous movement, the anti-nuclear movement at first. And it began in southwest Germany, near Wiel. But it wasn't a left-wing movement at first. It was very heterogeneous. So you have local agricultural farmers, wine growers who were worried that the nuclear plans for a nuclear power plant, that this plant would change the local conditions, that the waste heat water would be pumped back into the rivers and would destroy the local ecosystems, and that would affect farming, that the cooling towers would actually change the local atmosphere. And so it was local protests that first started. And then people realized, people like Petra Kelly, that this was going to be a national movement. That there were several local protests going on. Then up in the north, in 76 and 77, you have other protests going on. And one of the big issues. So there are two big issues. One was kind of fear of radiation, what to do with the byproduct and the leftover spent uranium, and how to store it, and what would happen in the event of a meltdown or a leak. So issues surrounding radiation and storage. And then the other was the issue of kind of state power going too far, right? So there's an argument that the Greens begin to make. Well, they're not the Greens yet. They don't form a party until 1980. There's an argument that the anti-nuclear movement makes, that the amount of state power that you need to properly oversee and manage a dangerous energy like this for generations, right, to store nuclear spent fissile material, really for generations, is unprecedented. And here again, there's a connection to the German past, and this is, I think, unique to Germany, that they link the type of state power that they fear is necessary to nuclear power to the Third Reich and the expansion of state power. And so you see people like Robert Jungk, who's an Austrian journalist who's writing about this, that he and others make comparisons between the nuclear state, the Atomstaat, that is emerging in the 1970s, and the Third Reich. Now, this is kind of a hyperbolic claim, but this is also the decade when Germany is going through its own very intense reckoning with the memory of Nazi Germany. You have Willy Brandt, doing the bending his knee at the Warsaw Memorial. You have the Holocaust miniseries in 78 and 79, and a series of other events that really kind of provokes German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or kind of overcoming the past, or reckoning with the past. So that's one reason why this particular argument about kind of the expansion of state power resonates, I think, with the German public. And again, it kind of crosses political boundaries. So it's not just a left concern. Middle class people are concerned about this. Even some on the right are concerned about this. So those are, this issue of kind of long-term storage and radiation, but then also the linkage that people in the anti-nuclear movement make to kind of fears of of expanding state power, that makes the movement very powerful. One and the big factor is that then this movement begins to threaten traditional political parties, above all the Social Democrats. They've been in power in the main political party since 1969. By the late 1970s, they're worried that the anti-nuclear movement is going to form a new party to the left of the SPD and take away voters, and take away, above all, youth voters. And so you have this creates this intense discussion within the SPD about what to do and how to respond. And so people like Helmut Schmidt, kind of discount the anti-nuclear movement, say it's a bunch of crackpots. People like Erhard Epler and Willy Brandt says that the SPD needs to become green itself, and to do more to incorporate environmental ideas and ideas about energy efficiency to woo the young voters, many of whom are leaving the SPD and will go on to join Green Party lists. There are local Green Party lists that form in 1977 and 1978. And then a national party forms in 1980. And so this is almost an existential crisis for the SPD. And you see some very interesting energy discussions that the party has in the late 70s.
Were there similar movements in other countries as well at the same time?
Yes and no. So I don't know about Scandinavia as much, and I wish I did. And this is where I would do more research in the future. There are similar anti-nuclear protests in France, and in fact, there's some very interesting work done by Stephen Milder and Andrew Tompkins and some other historians to show how the anti-nuclear movement was very much transnational in the 1970s. That the Germans were going to France and learning what the French were doing, and there was a lot of back and forth. The French nuclear movement fizzles. There's a number of reasons for that. Again, I'm not a French historian, but partly it's the organization of the French state, which is very unitary, and they have one big electricity company, EDF, Électricité de France, which is building the nuclear plants, and EDF is able to mobilize to lobby the government to continue building nuclear power, and EDF is hugely influential. Nuclear power as well was very much linked in France to national prestige since de Gaulle, that he talked about the force de frappe, and France got nuclear weapons, and this is an important part of being kind of a third power, in contrast to the Soviets and the Americans, that the French wanted to carve out their own way. So there's a number of kind of political reasons why France does not have as robust of an anti-nuclear movement. In Germany, it's a federal system, and so local protests can access local courts, and that's how they stop reactor buildings, because they mobilize counter expertise who come to local courts or state level courts and make arguments that the state courts accept, and so the state courts begin to put holds and a moratorium on building nuclear and building nuclear power. The last thing that I would say is that the nature of the German political system makes it easier for a new small party to enter the fray, right? You have to have 5% of the vote or more. The Greens get this in 1983. It's very different from America, where it's a dual party system, almost impossible for a third party to break in to the national system, just because of the political structure. And in Germany, the Communist Party in the Federal Republic had been banned since the 1950s. And so there was space on the left of the Democrats that a formal Communist Party could not occupy, but that the Greens could kind of, in a way, occupy that political space. So there's a number of different reasons why you see the Greens emerge in Germany, but not in France, and not in America, and not in Britain as well.
So there's one part that really interests me is how I think now in 2023 in April, I think the last power plants were shut down. And if they are not state-owned or partly state-controlled, how does that process look like? How are they able to go and just say to the companies, yeah, you're not here anymore, you won't be doing your work?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know all the ins and outs of the agreement, but I do know that there's even though the German state doesn't own the nuclear plants, there's so much regulatory oversight over the nuclear power industry that there's heavy state monitoring of fissile material, nuclear material, heavy state monitoring of where plants are stationed when they were being built. And the first of these nuclear phase-out agreements was made with the Red-Green Coalition. You know, it came to power in 1998. They had a big, long debate up until 2001 and 2002. And this is a negotiation where the state spoke with utility companies, um, uh, brought in external experts, and it was a negotiation. And the nuclear power industry got a lot out of that negotiation around 2000, 2001. And basically, the Greens who were in power wanted to shut down nuclear power plants as fast as possible. And what they got was a 30-year time horizon. And the ability of the nuclear power companies and the utilities to kind of close down whichever plant they wanted to and keep other plants online much longer. So that's an example of the state only having so much power. But once that precedent was set, then there was a new atomic law that was drafted that called for the shutdown of these reactors. That set a kind of a legal precedent, and that's what Angela Merkel drew on after Fukushima. You know, she actually wanted to phase out the phase out before Fukushima, so she comes to power. And wants to keep nuclear power on as much as possible. But then Fukushima, happens. This is the meltdown in Japan in 2011, and then she can look back to the legal precedent of the first atomic phase out, and that's when the nuclear power plants were agreed legally to be shut down in 2021 and 2022, and so that this is already a planned phase out. What happened last year? It was extended because of for emergency circumstances, but these decisions were taken kind of a decade ago or more.
And then Germany switched back to oil as its main energy source, or?
Well, so this is when the story gets complicated and interesting, and the hope of the Red-Green Coalition was that renewables would replace nuclear power, and for a while, renewables were a minuscule part of the energy sector in 2000, but there's an explosion after 2000 when the Red-Green Coalition passed the Renewable Energy Act, which pumped a lot of money into renewables. So there is the hope that renewables would replace nuclear power. But there's also lignite coal plants have a mild renaissance of sorts. This is partly due to this is in the 2000 late 2000s going into 2010. This is partly due to EU policy as well. That there's the European emissions trading system that tries to put a price on carbon, but they actually just hand out carbon polluting certificates, and this gives utilities kind of free rein to do what they want and actually to build more lignite plants. So you see lignite power plants growing, or new ones coming online in the 2000s. And then there's major technological innovations in the natural gas sector. And so natural gas expands a lot outside of heating into electricity production in the 2000s and the 2010s. And that takes up a lot of the slack that nuclear power had once produced. So it's kind of a mixture. All the while, overall energy use is stagnating or actually declining as well. So this is another part of the story, that the German economy is becoming more efficient in general. Other economies are everywhere, but the Germans are doing this. Peak energy use in Germany happens in 1979, actually 1980, after the second energy crisis. And energy use kind of declines every, not steadily, but on average since 1979.
Interesting. How do carbon emissions in nuclear, in oil, or in coal rank against each other?
Yeah, so lignite is the worst. Oil is not used for electricity generation, but carbon emissions are high in oil as well. Nuclear, it's very low. It's not it's not absolutely zero, but kind of processing the uranium. When you shut down a plant and bring it back online, that there are things involved that that generate carbon. So nuclear is very low. Renewables are also very low, and natural gas is kind of in between. I mean, the big story about natural gas is it's sold as a climate bridge fuel. It's very consciously marketed as a bridge fuel in climate change because it's methane. Methane burns relatively clean. When it burns, carbon it doesn't go up in the air as much. And so the actual kind of carbon footprint of natural gas plants is much smaller than a coal plant. And nuclear, I'm sorry, natural gas boosters use this and say, look, gas is a clean fuel and we should use it. The issue, though, is methane leakage. And this has become much more of a problem. People have become much more aware of this. There's a big IPCC report, International Panel on Climate Change report that came out, I think, in 2021 or 2022, that paid a lot of attention to leakage and in natural gas pipelines. And they now estimate that methane accounts for something like 25 to 35% of greenhouse gas or of global warming, right? So it's not, this is no longer a carbon story. And leakage from natural gas is a huge problem. And it turns out that the network and the infrastructure through which the Germans were getting a lot of their natural gas from Siberia through pipelines built by the Soviet Union is very leaky, right? So a lot of this stuff is kind of being emitted into the air. Central Asian states have major problems as well. Germany doesn't get as much of their natural gas from Central Asia. That often goes to China. America has its problems too, but leakage is a major issue, and methane is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon because it traps heat a lot more. It doesn't last as long as carbon, but it traps a lot more heat. So, but this is a story that people kind of knew about, scientists kind of knew about in the 1990s. If you dig into the IPCC reports then, but it really only became, people really only realized the problem, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think it became much more public.
Interesting. And because that's something that always that I never really understood. The why the negatives of the negatives of nuclear are obviously after Fukushima revealed drastically, but since they have so low emissions, isn't there an argument to be made that it might be better to have at least some nuclear plants, as so that if renewables won't become the new energy source, if it doesn't work as planned, then we don't have these high emissions?
Yeah, that is a very powerful argument. And I think that this is part of the political debate right now, very much playing out between France, which has a very low carbon footprint because most of their power comes from nuclear, and Germany, which has taken a different path and is pursuing renewables. There's a lot of tension about this, and I think it's can be a very powerful argument. So there are a couple kind of issues at play here. One is that people often make the argument, well, nuclear and renewables, they're good complements. Why don't we use French nuclear power and German renewables, and they'll complement each other? But it turns out nuclear power, well, let me back up and say renewables are intermittent. And that's one of the big challenges, right? If it's a sunny day and a windy day, then Germany actually produces more energy or more electricity than it uses, and then it begins to export electricity around Europe. If it's a cloudy day where there's no wind, then Germany doesn't produce a lot of energy. So there's this intermittency problem. Nuclear power is hard to ramp up and ramp down. It's very good at kind of burning at a steady level, but it's very costly and even can be dangerous to expand capacity very quickly and then reduce capacity very quickly. So in that sense, nuclear and renewables are not great complements. Oil and natural gas, unfortunately, are very good complements with renewables because it's very easy just to add coal and natural gas. It's very easy just to add more coal to a power plant or add more natural gas to a power plant when renewables ebb, and then you have, it's very easy to increase the fossil fuel use as renewables come down. So there's this kind of technological problem. I think that it's, there's also the argument about building new nuclear reactors, and that is very expensive. A number of kind of experts, business, businesses come out with estimates of what's called the levelized cost of energy, which tries to assess how much it costs for a particular energy type to produce power. This is a very hard estimate to do because a lot of different things go into it. But with the levelized cost of energy, nuclear power is not cheap. It costs a lot to build a new power plant. They often go over in terms of how much they cost. They take a very long time to build. So it's hard to bring new nuclear capacity online. Europe really hasn't done it. Finland, I think, is just finishing a new plant. England and France are building some new plants, but it's going to be years until they come online, I think. So that's a different argument than keeping existing plants online, and that's a much better plan. But then you have this fact of Germany that the Green Party, in its DNA, is an anti-nuclear stance from the 1970s. I have this interesting quote from Jürgen Trittin, who is a Green leader in the Red-Green Coalition, who's instrumental in shutting off or organizing the first nuclear phase out, and he said the reason we founded the party was to shut down nuclear power, right? That's why the party exists. I mean, it's obviously evolved, the Green Party has, so it's not only about that anymore, but very hard for a political party to kind of go against its raison d'etre, I would say.
What's your own opinion? How should have Germany reacted to the problems facing it in terms of nuclear? How should it have adapted? Should it have shut down the plants, or shouldn't have?
I think it should not have shut down the plants. I think I think at the very least it should have kept the 3 online. There were 6 online up until December of 2021, I think, and it shut down those 3, and then it shut down 3 of those 6, and then shut down the final 3. And I think that they should have kept them on and had a planned phase out. The problem is that renewables did not grow as fast as anticipated during the 2010s. Partly because the subsidies were scaled back under Angela Merkel after fears of renewables costing too much. And there were more regulatory hurdles for building new wind farms. A lot of that changed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where it's become easier to build renewables in Germany from a regulatory standpoint. But that means that it's going to take another, 5 or 6 years until Germany meets targets that maybe it should have met in 2020. And so I think it would have been a great idea to keep nuclear energy online until then for another 5 or 6 years. And you see some coal plants have had to be brought back online during the natural gas crisis of 2022. Not as much as some people say. Like, some coal plants were taken back online, but they weren't necessarily operating in a high capacity. So I think people overplay that. But I didn't used to have this philosophy, though. I used to be more of somebody who would say, let's shut down nuclear power plants. The risks are too high. They're very expensive. But the climate crisis has just become so terrible, and it's become so palpable and apparent that we're not about to have a climate crisis, but we're at the beginning of one. In Europe, you've experienced that with droughts, forest fires. In America, we've been experiencing this. I did my grad work in California, and there's been this decade-long drought. And then just last year, it switched, and you had these, overwhelming rains that kind of, created these mudslides, and hurricanes have intensified. So everywhere you look, there's signs that climate change is upon us, and so that has changed my calculus. Where 10 years ago, we may have had the chance to have a more careful, thought out path, but now we need to throw everything we can at this issue, and so that means keeping nuclear power plants on for a while. I think that's something that you do. I don't think it's worth investing a lot of money and political capital to build new nuclear power plants, for the reasons that I said. And the levelized cost of renewables is coming down, and battery storage costs, which is the great complement with renewables. It solves the intermittency problem. That too, those costs are coming down very rapidly. There are obviously a lot of issues in terms of rare earth minerals, where you get the inputs that you need for renewables. So there are, geopolitical problems associated with renewables, but the costs are very low, and they're only going to get even lower. So it's much easier to scale up renewables at this point than it is to scale up nuclear. The last thing I'll say about nuclear is most of the uranium that you get for European-based nuclear plants, a lot of it comes from Russia, right? A lot of it comes from Russian plants that, they have the expertise and the capacity still. And a lot of European uranium is, comes either from sub-Saharan Africa or, from Russian plants. So there are geopolitical problems with nuclear as well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Because that would be the next point I would touch upon, the reliance on Russia when it comes to energy, and how that actually happened, how you would solve for that.
Yeah. Well, there's a history behind this. The network of pipelines connecting Germany, really all of Central Europe, with Russia is a product of the Cold War, and it's a product of a thaw in the Cold War in the 1970s when Willy Brandt and the SPD, also people in Austria, believed that that softening relations with the Eastern Bloc was important, and that commercial ties was one way to do this, Ostpolitik, in Willy Brandt's term. And one of the big infrastructural projects that came to be first in 1969, but then even more so after the oil shock in 1973, was building these big pipelines to pump natural gas from Siberia, which the Russians just discovered in the 1960s, that they were sitting atop this huge amount of natural gas. And to pump this natural gas into the industrial centers in the cities of Central Europe, the Russians didn't have the capacity to do this, or the technology. That they had to use Western pipeline technology to build these massive pipes that were reinforced, that only major and the best steel and manufacturing companies of Western Europe and America could build. And so you have these big tripartite deals where the Western Europeans provided the finance and the technology to build the pipes, and then the Russians pump the natural gas through the pipes, and that this had a political valence as well. And so this is a Cold War thing. This is a Cold War project. There were, though, fears that the Soviets could use this as geopolitical leverage. There was a big natural gas dispute in 1981 and 1982 between America and its Western allies, when one of the biggest pipelines, the Yamal pipeline from the Urengoy Siberian field, was planned to be built by European companies, and Reagan and his neocon political advisors said, no, you're going to put yourself in danger of being geopolitically manipulated by the Soviet Union. And the Americans actually put sanctions on Western European companies. But Helmut Schmidt and Western European companies and government said, no, we're going to go ahead and build this anyhow, partly because in the early 80s, there was very high unemployment, and this generated a lot of jobs, the contracts, and it promised more cheap and stable energy and alternatives to Middle Eastern energy. This is coming out of the two oil shocks. So this is another kind of moment of interest. And in the 1990s, more networks were built. This is when there was a Russian gas bubble, where Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. Its economies collapsed. Energy use in the former Soviet Union declined precipitously, and Gazprom, which is the successor of the Soviet Ministry of Gas, was sitting on this mountain of natural gas that the Russian economy was no longer using. And so they looked to market it into Western Europe. And so they began to strike deals with more Western European companies. And this is when Gazprom took an interest in Western European infrastructure and began to set up joint companies with BASF and Wintershall, which was a subsidiary of BASF, the big chemical company that consumes a lot of natural gas. And so this is another key moment. of natural gas infrastructure building.
How much of the gas comes from Russia or came from Russia? In percentage, roundabout.
Yeah, so it was around 25 to 30% for a while, but then then it actually declined for a little bit around 2010 because of the American shale gas revolution. That in America, there's new technology that could capture new types of gas embedded in shale regions. That didn't actually find its way to Europe, but it kind of found its way to other markets, and then other markets supplied natural gas to European markets. But then Russian natural gas kind of the Russians responded to this by offering better terms, longer term contracts, and so then you see an uptick in Russian natural gas use after say 2014, 2015, and I think it peaks out. I've seen different estimates. Some say it peaked out around 40%. Some say it peaked out as high as 50%. There's some question about the accounting mechanism. Part of the challenge of this is that the gas industry was being liberalized by the European Union, but there were still a lot of long-term opaque contracts. So it was hard to see exactly what the price it was in these long-term contracts, and sometimes how much was being used in these long-term contracts. But somewhere around 40 to 50% of German natural gas was coming from Russia at one point in 2020 or so. Norway is another big supplier. Algeria is a big supplier of Southern Europe. Qatar is becoming a big supplier of Europe as well, and Britain from the North Sea. Yeah.
Britain? Oh, I actually didn't know that.
No, sorry. The Netherlands, the Groningen fields.
Okay.
Yeah, which those are declining.
Those are declining right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wait. The energy exports to Germany are declining from the
Netherlands.
States.
So yeah,
from the Netherlands. Okay.
Yeah. Those are fields that used to be big in the 1970s and the 1980s, but they've begun to decline since the 1990s. So Norway is the new big supplier right now. Yeah.
In regards to your time, I would like to move over to our second fast segment, which is the rapid fire questions.
Oh boy.
I got some prepared for you. Some are more to your personal opinions, the others in regard to your knowledge on energy. So please answer in 2 to 3 sentences. That would be perfect. If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it, what would you put on it?
About German energy?
No. Your personal opinion in general. What you want. You can put anything you want.
Okay. We need to do everything we can to fight climate change. Any type of policy, any type of industrial policy, any type of energy, everything we can do, we should do to fight climate change.
Do you have a favorite quote?
Oh, yeah. The John Maynard Keynes quote about the opinions of political leaders are often informed by some long dead economists raving in the past. I forget the exact quote, but it's about the influence of ideas and how they persist over time.
A controversial opinion, I believe, what nobody else does.
Oh. I don't know. Can we come back to that? Sorry.
Of course. You can just skip them.
Yeah.
What would you have liked to know when you were 20?
I would have liked to know more about environmental problems and environmental sciences in general. That I only came to my interest in climate in the last 5 or 10 years, and I wish that I would have learned more about environmental challenges at an earlier time.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
My newest or my news?
My newest.
Yeah, newest. That batteries are going to be hugely important for solving the climate challenge. The ability to store energy is where we need to put a lot of our research.
Maybe that touches upon that. What do you see in your area in energy as the biggest current problem?
The geopolitics of renewables. where do you get the lithium for the batteries? Where do you get the rare earth minerals to build batteries and to build solar components?
That's okay. Okay, then my next question doesn't perfectly fit. I will go to the next one. How would you spend $10 billion to make the world, a better place?
I would. Uh, I would spend $10 billion making the electrical grid in America and Europe and other parts of the world work better. Grids are horribly expensive to build and to improve, and that's also a key part of the problem, being able to move electricity across far distances.
We have we have oil, we have gas, coal, renewables. Let's put them all, or let's say solar, nuclear, solar, hydro, and wind, and we have nuclear.
Geothermal as well.
Geothermal. Okay. So we got, I think, 8 different energy sources. If you had to eliminate one, or you could eliminate one worldwide, which would it be?
It would have to be coal. Do you want an explanation?
Sorry.
Yeah. Coal plants are just terrible for the environment, and I think we have the ability to replace them right now.
If you could choose 3 out of these, and all others get eliminated, which one would you choose?
Geothermal, renewables, hydro.
Okay, also please an explanation for that.
Okay, geothermal is actually incredible. So it's geographically limited, but you dig down, find geothermal hotspots, sink a boiler down there, and it generates super cheap electricity. And I think that if we find enough of these places and invest in it, it can be a great energy of the future. Renewables you can build around the world, tailored to each environment. They're very cheap, and this is the wave of the future. And hydro, I think, is also geographically bounded, but it can be incredibly cheap and incredibly important as well.
When you evaluate these sources, when you think about them, what are the key metrics you look at?
Scalability, how fast you can scale things up, the cost of the energy, how geographically how it can be geographically distributed, which is a challenge for hydro, right? Because not every place has hydropower. And obviously pollution and the carbon or the GHG, greenhouse gas emissions footprint.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. If you want to know more about his insights, about Stephen's insights, check out his book, Energy and Power, Germany in the Age of Oil, Atoms and Climate Change. I will obviously link it down in the description. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I think, the one thing that would have been interesting to talk about, which I'm not as much of an expert about, is about EU level policymaking in energy, where my story is a national story because it ends in 2000, but now the story is a European level story about how Europe as a whole is transitioning to a different energy future, partly because the EU has such political power and political influence today in a way that it didn't in the 1980s and the 1990s.
I mean, you're saying you're not an expert in it, but maybe do you want to add a few more words?
Yeah, that there are hard negotiations that the EU has to go through, just like in America, but on a nation to nation level. Like Poland, for example, is a big coal producer. France uses nuclear. Germany's pushing into renewables, and that these things have to be navigated in Brussels somehow. So this is a big challenge. But there's also big opportunities to build a better, more integrated European continental-wide electricity grid. Is something that really can only be done on the European level, and that would be that is the way that the EU is moving, and that would be a big help in kind of solving the energy problem.
Well, thanks again, Stephen, and check out his book, and have a great day.
Thank you, Timo. This is great.